They say opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one. Most of them stink. And mine is the best. OP10 tier list, baby. So, this is the post-ban tier list, and we've got these tiers here. Tiers 1 through 2 are fairly self-explanatory. The Dodgy tier is something that I think you could take as a rogue pick or a meta counter to a regional, and maybe do alright, but I can't see it winning consistently at any level. And the Stinking Ass tier, you can win locals with this, but these decks are not advised for competitive play, and I've filled this out. Some of these you may have comments on, put them in the comments below, but until I see anything substantial from these leaders, I'm going to leave them all in the Stinking Ass tier until someone cooks up a new build. So in the Premier League, you've got a big 6. In this format, I think we're going to have a big 5, and those big 5 are, to very little surprise I imagine, Blackbeard, Red Green Smoker, Red Shanks, Bonnie, and who's last? Who could it be? I think it's Purple Luffy. Now, the order of these, I'm not as convinced on. I think Bonnie is the weakest of the 5, followed by Purple Luffy. I think my order is going to be something like this. Maybe Blackbeard behind Shanks. I think these two are going to be the best 2 decks in the format. I'm pretty happy with Smoker in 3rd. And then I think these two are a little bit weaker, but still strong enough to be in tier 1. So these are going to represent vastly different strategies. So I think Blackbeard is going to be the stone that the format is warped around. He's inherently incredibly strong right now, with the new additions of 5-cost Kuzan, Liberation, and the new 4-cost Shiryu to combat the aggro matchups. This deck it's no joke. It's a really good deck now. It's not like it was in OP10. And with the massive nerf to Doflamingo, you now, in that matchup in specific, have way more cards because you don't have to turn off their on-plates immediately, as you're not fearing Jinbei. And some of the decks that are rising to the top inherently have somewhat weak matchups into Blackbeard, like Bonnie, for example, and Shanks is around 50-50. It is a downside that BY Luffy and the black decks in Lucci and Smoker have taken a massive hit from the ban list, but for me, this is what everyone is going to be playing, and if this isn't number 1, it's certainly tier 1, and I think this is really the deck to beat. Shanks, I've got at number 2. I think Shanks has very good options into the vast majority of decks in this meta. It's true that some roguer picks like Bello Betty can sometimes be troublesome, but you have answers that you can tech into whatever matchups you're expecting at your events. If you're expecting lots of Blackbeard, you can run more Rush. If you're expecting lots of Zoro or Purple Luffy, you can run more Control. Having inherently a good matchup into both Bonnie and Smoker, I think is a great starting point in this format, and I think your Teach matchup is very reasonable as well. It's certainly not negative, and the fact that you can tech for whatever you want is why I think that Shanks is going to be really strong in this format. The loss of Lucci is really good for this deck. The massive nerf of Lucci is really good for this deck, because that was one of your tougher matchups for sure. Smoker and Bonnie are sort of 2 sides of the same coin. Both of these are 8-cost Kid decks, and 8-cost Kid is being quite heavily teched into at the minute, which is why I think Smoker, for me, is just a little bit stronger, because you have access to those removal cards like Ben Beckman, and you have far more aggression, being able to restand your Dons to get so much value out of them. The 5-Don play of Smoker, restand 3, play out Shigi, is just great into so many matchups. It means that Blackbeard cannot remove your 5-cost Smoker on curve, which is great because that banish into Blackbeard is brilliant. And it also means that other removal decks like Shanks or like Lucci also just can't remove that Smoker. They have to focus their efforts on the Tashigi first, which can be a problem. Into Bonnie, you have red cards, so you can reduce the power of their Kid in mirrors, and you can also reduce the power of, for example, their Zoro, if you really need to remove a Zoro, for example. And into Pluffy, you are a Kid deck. Of course, they can run Gamma Knife, but inherently Kid is just quite strong into Pluffy, and the banish into Pluffy is no joke. Pluffy, he's unchanged from last format. Doflamingo being massively nerfed helps him a lot. Of course, I do think Doflamingo is still going to be a strong deck. However, not having Jinbei and not having the aggression, well, that's where Ploofy suffered the most in that matchup. It was the aggression they pumped out with so many bodies in the early game that Ploofy suffered with. If Ploofy made it into his late game is actually quite strong into Doflamingo, with cards like the Rush Luffy and the 9-cost Lin Lin. You can lengthen the game for a long time with your Gum Gum Giants, but it was that early game where he really suffered, and also the nerf of the black decks is just great for Ploofy. In terms of Ploofy's matchups into the others of the big five, I think both Smoker and Bonnie can be quite difficult, certainly winnable, but 8-cost Kid is inherently quite tough for us to get around. So both these decks I see as slightly losing. I think Shanks, it really depends on who goes first. If Ploofy is able to go first, Shanks can be a pretty good matchup, but if you go second, it's a lot tougher. Into Blackbeard, I would say you're pretty favoured as Ploofy. You have great aggression, great 5-cost bodies that are hard for them to remove, with the only option being the unsearchable finger gun, and drawing extra cards with Gum Gum Giant and Sangoro means that in the late game, you're not going to get rushed out of the game by an angry Jesus Burgess. Bonnie, I think, is very similar to Smoker. You've got some different options. They're often running 10-cost Doflamingo and 9-cost Zoro for a bit more control to lengthen the game out. You inherently have a little bit less aggression into decks like Blackbeard, which kind of sucks. And the fact that you can only play the 3-cost Tashigi a little bit later than Smoker can gives you a slightly weaker matchup into the removal decks. But Bonnie, I think, has a better matchup into the aggro decks like Zoro. Being able to just have that extra life as a barrier, and playing cards like Carrot and 10-cost Doflamingo, in addition to 8-cost Kid, really gives you some wiggle room into the aggro decks that Smoker doesn't. In terms of these matchups, like we've gone over them all already, Ploofy I think is pretty good. Into Smoker, I think Smoker is slightly favoured. Shanks is a very tough matchup. They have a lot of power down and quite a lot of removal. And Blackbeard can also be a tough matchup, but if you see the right combination of Zoros and Hody Joneses, it's certainly winnable. Next, I want to talk about the decks that were affected most by the bans. NL, I'm going to put in Dodgy. The loss of Rhaego makes it that your Blackbeard matchup is even less winnable. Your Shanks matchup is now quite bad. And your matchup into these other decks have certainly not gotten any better. NL's main selling point now is he's very good into aggro. If you're expecting a lot of Doflamingo players or a lot of Zoro players, NL is a very reasonable pick. You still have lots of funny triggers, and you're quite aggressive yourself now, because you have to lean into that aggressive playstyle. Unfortunately, I think there are yellow leaders that just do that job a little bit better than NL, whilst also having a better game into these tier 1 decks. Next up, we've got Dofi and Boa. So I think Dofi is better than Boa, and it really shouldn't be. So if we're talking about matchups, let's go over Boas, right? You're pretty good into Blackbeard because you can remove everything with events. You've got Raging Tiger for their burgers, and you've got Red Rock for their teachers. Into Shanks, this matchup actually is pretty good because you can Red Rock all their big stuff, and your 10-cost Kaido is very good into Shanks. Into Smoker and Bonnie, it gets a little bit more difficult because of that new 3-cost Tashigi. They can sort of spam that on the board. You have a really tough time doing much of anything. And whilst Kid is, of course, Red Rockable, like I say, if that Tashigi's there, you do struggle with Kid significantly. Ploofy is quite fast, and I'd say this is a close matchup. Of course, if you can hit the right things, you can win. But Ploofy spamming units and being very fast makes it quite difficult for Boa to deal with. Doflamingo, on the other hand, has still a good time into Blackbeard, but notably a worse time than he used to. I think now Doflamingo is quite unfavoured in Shanks, mainly the control builds. If you're playing against Rush Shanks, it's more winnable. Into both Smoker and Bonnie, these Kid decks are tough. Of course, you can Red Rock them, but like I said with Boa, they're going to have that Shigi. You've got to find the Law plus Red Rock combo, but inherently, I would say these matchups are slightly losing. Ploofy, I think, is a close matchup now. It used to be very favourable for Doflamingo, but without Jinbei's aggression, Ploofy has a lot more time. This is massively going to be favoured for whoever wins the coin flip and goes first. I don't think Dofi quite has it anymore to hang with these big dogs. The loss of the aggression from Jinbei just makes your removal matchup so much harder, and it makes your pressure into decks like Bonnie and Smoker a lot weaker as well, which you're going to be eating less cards, so their kid is even stronger if you cannot remove it. Boa should be tier 1, but there's so many games I have with this deck in practice when my hand is just ass. Either I'm not seeing red rocks and they aren't unsearchable, or my hand is just full of like 10 bricks. This deck should be better, and if someone can crack a list, I'm happy to move her up. But currently, with how inconsistent this deck feels, I can't put it higher than tier 2. Next up, let's talk about some black decks. So, Lucci and Smoker. So, where are we going to put these? Both of these I've played quite recently on the channel. I thought they were going to be a lot worse than they actually are. So, I'm going to put both in tier 1.5. And I think I'm going to put Smoker slightly above Lucci. Smoker has access to the 5-cost Shigi and the 1-cost Sengoku. The 1-cost Sengoku increases your consistency in seeing your top end and seeing your tech cards. The 5-cost Shigi is just an incredibly good tempo removal for the mid game. Lucci has better access to Rebecca because he can afford to run Mancheri because you fill your trash. Rebecca is an incredibly important card to see for these black decks now. Now that you don't have Moria, you kind of just have to draw them. And I've had 1 or 2 games with these decks where you see 0 Rebecca and you just lose because you don't have any blockers. And that is a real thing now. Of course, both of these are still excellent at removing everything. Lucci having access to Tempest Kick is a massive selling point over Smoker. But in general, I think the Tashigi and the draw of the Sengoku is slightly better than access to Tempest Kick and slightly better access to Rebecca. And that's why I'm putting Smoker higher. Generally, these guys have very similar matchups across the board. Blackbeard is tough for both of them, but they are both now running more copies of 9-cost Kaido, so at least you have that to remove the burgers. Still, I think Blackbeard is favoured into both of these. Shanks now as well, I think, is favoured into both of these. And these two are sort of the main reasons why I don't think I can put these in tier 1. Shanks just has a consistent top end. And without Ice Age and without Moria, you do not have consistent removal anymore. You've got to draw into either your top end or like all the Rebeccas in the world. We are, however, still favoured into these green decks, even with Jashigi in the building. You're still just pretty good at removing the green deck cards. They have very little aggression in the green decks. So you're able to take your time establishing Brooks, and even some bigger top end like an Isho is very powerful into these decks. I think that is one of the main selling points of these black decks, is you're very good into aggro, like Zoro, and you're also pretty strong into these green decks. Purple Luffy, the late game is still pretty strong for you into Purple Luffy, but that early game is significantly weaker now without access to Ice Age, and that's why I've sort of got these in tier 1.5. I think you've got good matchups into green, an okay matchup into Luffy, but weak matchups into these top 2. Let's talk about some other black decks. I think I'm going to put Red Black Sabo in Dodgy. This Dodgy tier is not going to be ordered. Everything else above will be. Red Black Sabo has good matchups into removal and Dodgy matchups into everything else. Moria, I'm going to say the same. I do want to test a bit of Moria with the new 4-cost Ryuma, but I've not really seen anyone talking about it. So until I see otherwise, I'm going to put him in Dodgy. Without Ice Age, this guy has like no reduction now. It really sucks. Smoker's got Tashigi. Lucci's got Tempest Kick. Smoker has kind of not very much. And in the same vein, ST14 Luffy. This guy might be stinking ass now, but I'm still going to give him the credit of this is a 6k leader. That's pretty good. And put him in Dodgy. Purple Black Luffy. This is transformed into just a let's play Nika as fast as we can type deck. Because you don't have Moria anymore. And Ice Age to a lesser extent. That's fine. But I think there's purple decks that are just better than this now. You really have nothing black that's worth playing anymore other than the 5-cost Sanji, which is a good tempo play, but there's no real reason to play this, unfortunately, which is a shame because I really like this. Hopefully that starter deck helps him out. Ah, yes. Black Yellow Luffy. Rest in peace. This deck is dead. I've seen some people putting this in tier 2. I'm sorry, there's no way. I can count the amount of times I've lost to a Black Yellow Luffy that didn't see Moria on like No hands. I don't think I've ever lost to a Black Yellow Luffy that has not seen Moria. This deck sucks without Moria. I'm sure maybe someone will come up with a build in 2 months' time that's not that bad. But for now, this guy sucks. Ah, yes, one more. Perona. Perona, last format, I would have put at the bottom of tier 2. She did have like one showing in a regional. And the deck was quite fun and honestly not that bad. Without Moria and without Ice Age, I'm not seeing it. And those cards were so important for this deck. I really don't see how she survives without those. You should still be alright into green, but that's kind of it. I think Perona is just not worth playing anymore. I'd rather play any of these mono black decks that have unique selling points of their own outside of Ryuma and have an extra life. Now let's look at the rest of the OP10 leaders. Caesar is stinking ass. This deck is terrible. I tried this deck, really want it to be good, because it seems quite cool. The leader effect inherently seems strong. But no, this leader sucks. This leader straight up sucks. And honestly, I'm really sad to say it, but I think the same about Lore. This is like a deck that if you put 1,000,000 hours into and have a Giga Brain, you can get about 50% of the power of Bonnie. What's the point, man? What's the point? Once we get that Bedge in the next set, I think this is a little more promising because then you don't just fold to removal. You just mostly fold to removal. I just don't see a reason to put the effort into trying this deck, honestly. Sugar, I've seen some people talking about this recently, but from all the testing that I've done, this leader was horrible. The problems I have with Sugar are sort of twofold. The events we have access to are not that incredible, and also the Don Quixote Pirates package, there's just not enough of it. Like, the quality is there. The Dofi Taro and the Rosnante are both really good cards, as well as Senor Pink, he's a great card too. But there's just not enough characters in this deck. This is a heavily event-focused deck. Feels almost like Nami. But for me, it just doesn't cut the mustard when it comes to dealing with a lot of this top stuff. Usopp, I'm going to put in tier 2, and I'm going to put him in a very similar place to Boa. This tier 2, as we go on, you'll see, is going to become this deck's actually pretty good, but it's also kind of inconsistent tier. Usopp, if you see a curve, you drop Rebecca, Kiros, Zoro, or Rebecca, Kiros, Cavendish on 7. Really good. Stage gives you an incredible matchup into Aggro, and also a pretty reasonable matchup into Teach. Red Rock gives you a good game into a lot of these top decks. It's really good into Teach. Red Rock's really good into Shanks, but the rest of your deck does struggle into Shanks. And the rest of these green decks are fine if you can get the combo of Zoro plus Red Rock. Very similar to the Lore plus Red Rock combo that the blue decks have. Pluffy is also very reasonable. You just have removal and aggression in the same cards. So why is Usopp not higher? It's just not consistent, man. And the games where you don't see Stage, my god, this deck sucks. This deck without the Stage is horrific, and you do have good search for Stage. You have 2 searchers, but it's just not consistent enough for me to put it any higher, I'm afraid. I really want him to be good, and I think he does have potential. I would not be surprised to see Usopp win a regional. This tier 2 can absolutely win regionals. There's not that much difference in the quality between tier 1 and 2. It's just the consistency for me, and Usopp is just not quite there at the minute for me. Last up, Kid. I'm going to put Kid into 1.5. In terms of your matchups, your matchup into Blackbeard, I think is close. If you're running the trigger-heavy build that I was running before, it's actually reasonably decent. Hawkins is really annoying if they can't find exactly the 4-cost black hole, and they have to be using their leader effect quite early, so they do run out of cards. If you can get 1 or 2 triggers here and there with things like Satori, Kikunojo, or the 3-cost Zoro, it's not that bad. It really isn't that bad, and the fact that you can make like your big guys blockers really stymies their aggression. Into Shanks, I honestly think Kid is actually quite good into Shanks. Shanks does not love life trash. You're removing his resources super aggressively with cards like Basil Hawkins and 6-cost Robin. And then in that late game, you can stall out 1 or 2 turns with like playing out a Lore, making it a blocker to remove some of Shanks' aggression. The green decks, I think, are a lot harder. They don't care that much about you trashing their life because they just hide behind Kid. and they are an 8k leader, and that is quite troublesome to deal with. Purple Luffy, as well, is just a little bit too aggressive for Kid to deal with, really. They don't care that much about your life trash because they're taking their own life anyway. So it kind of is what it is. And they have cards like 7-cost Sanji to rest your Hawkins that you make a blocker. Although I don't think this matchup's that bad, I do think it's slightly unfavored for Kid. Where Kid really suffers is the aggro decks. I think decks like Zoro, which are rising in popularity, and we'll cover them very soon, are just quite inherently strong into Kid. You're reasonably slow, and yes, you can make these blockers, but blocking one hit a turn isn't that great when they're swinging into you like 5 times from turn 3. So I think the premier yellow deck in this format is actually going to be Katakuri, and I'm going to put Katakuri around here. Katakuri is inherently quite aggressive and plays a lot of triggers. That's great into Blackbeard. 10 Mum is incredible into Shanks. These green decks, again, are a little bit harder, but spamming 10 Mum is really not bad. And the fact that you have so many trigger bodies really does give you that bit of extra aggression. It's not a good matchup. I do think these green decks are favoured into Kata, but it's by no means an auto loss, and there's a real chance to win, especially into Smoker, who is just a little bit more fragile to Katakuri's aggression in particular. Purple Luffy, I think, is a very close matchup. They are very, very aggressive, and they can absolutely rush you down. But if you can get to that late game where you're spamming 10 mums, there's not a lot they can do about that. And for that reason, I do think he's going to be the premier yellow deck. You've just got to avoid seeing too many aggro decks and too many Bonnies in particular. Let's talk about some rogue yellow decks. Kalgara. I'm going to put him in tier 2. He's another one. The deck is really quite strong. You have such crazy aggression playing out Kalgara Nolans and Wiper Wipers and Ohm Holy. But it's not consistent. You cannot find the Noland consistently. And into Blackbeard, having to take your own life to play dudes, honestly, that kind of sucks. I've found into Blackbeard, you do often just run out of life because you can't heal with the Noland. And when you just can't find that Noland, this deck really suffers. Other than that, it's pretty reasonable. It's got the same matchups as most of the other aggro decks, although your characters are quite large, similar to Purple Luffy's. Nico Robin, I think, is a bit dodgy. This deck is inherently quite good into Blackbeard because Banish on a leader is just quite good into Blackbeard, right? But in some of these more controlling decks, you really do suffer. Purple Luffy is just not going to let you deal Banish damage to them anyway, and has a lot of aggression to rush you down. And some of the other decks, like Zoro, will just rush you down before you have a chance to do much of anything. And Yamato, I'm going to put this deck in stinking ass. I don't like this deck. I really don't. Similarly to Nico Robin, you got a decent matchup into Blackbeard. You got a pretty bad matchup into these green decks. You got a pretty bad matchup into Shanks, and you've got a pretty bad matchup into Aggro. It's just not great. I really don't rate Yamato at all. But I'm really excited for that starter deck. I think that starter deck could make Yamato a lot more interesting. Pudding is like bad Kata. You just kind of lose for free to Blackbeard because you don't have the aggression that Kata does. And also you just hard lose to Aggro. Like Zoro and friends are free losses. So for that reason, I'm going to put Pudding at the in the dodgy tier. Red Yellow Sabo, I think, is an interesting one. This is completely untested, but I've been hearing a reasonable amount of chatter about him recently. The new 5-cost Luffy from Starter Deck 21 is quite a good card. I've seen that in Shanks, and I see no reason why it shouldn't be good in Red Yellow Sabo too. With triggers and the ability to become a 7k leader, you're both quite good into the slower decks and also the more aggressive decks, so this deck kind of has a bit of everything. What it doesn't have is doing one thing particularly well. It's kind of sort of defensive, sort of aggressive, doesn't go super wide. It's red, so you can play Mole Gun to beat Kid. It's alright, I don't know. This is untested, so I'm going to put it at the bottom of tier 2 because I'm not sure. But I think this could be a bit of a sleeper, this meta. Last couple of yellow decks. We've got Purple Yellow Croc. I'm going to put this in the bottom of Dodgy. This deck should be good. You've got Okama Way, which is incredible. And you've got great healing in the yellow Yamato, yellow Ace, purple Croc, and purple Big Mum. So I think this deck should be decent. it's just really, really slow. You kind of don't do anything. It plays almost like a stall deck, which ain't great. Your on plays don't do anything into Blackbeard, which sucks. And I think a lot of these aggro decks are just going to kill you before you have the time to do much. The final yellow deck is Viability, and that's going to lead us nicely into a bit of an aggro segment. I think I'm going to put Viability at the top of tier 2. This is all in. If you want all in aggro, Viability is your deck. You have a very good Blackbeard matchup. You have a pretty good Shanks matchup. Your green matchups, it sort of depends on how quickly they can establish Kid and how well you can answer that. I think Bonnie is going to be a lot rougher than Smoker in general because they have that extra life. They have more defense with the leader effect. You're very fast into Purple Luffy. They're going to have to be playing defense the whole time, and they don't really love doing that. They have to take their own life to play the game, and you punish that super hard. Outside of the big dogs, I think your matchups get a little bit sketchier. Doflamingo was always pretty good into Betty. You have so many resources as Dofi, and the lore is just incredible. Katakuri should be a pretty good matchup for Bello Betty. They don't really have the stuff to deal with aggression like Bello Betty puts out. The black decks have always been tough for Betty to deal with. However, they are weaker now, so the matchups are not going to be as bad as they used to be. Zoro, I think, is the premier aggro deck in this format, and I'm going to put him right below Doflamingo. You could put this above Doflamingo. In fact, maybe I will. I think I will put this above Doflamingo. In terms of the big five, you've got a great matchup into Blackbeard. You've got a slightly favoured matchup into Shanks. You've got a pretty weak matchup into these green decks, especially Bonnie. I think Bonnie is one of the toughest matchups you've got, but you should have a pretty good matchup into Pluffy. Where this deck also falls short is into some of these tier 1.5 and tier 2 options. The black decks are really bad. Doflamingo is really bad. Boa should be bad, but Boa's just not that consistent. Usopp is a bad matchup though. And personally, I think as the format goes on, Shanks is going to transition to playing more control cards, which inherently is going to make your Shanks matchup a bit tougher. Overall, I think Zoro is decent and probably the best aggro deck this format, unless you count Purple Luffy as a pure aggro deck, which I personally don't. You've got decent matchups into a lot of the top decks, but some dodgy matchups just beneath. So I wouldn't personally be confident taking this to a regional, because there are going to be some matches where your opponent flips their leader, and you know it's probably already over. Other aggro decks, let's talk about weaker options. RG Law is a bit like if you wanted to play Zoro, but lose to Blackbeard. All of his deck's power plays are on plays. The Blocker Law, your Otamas, all your stuff is on play. And that's kind of how the deck is designed. It gets value out of recycling on plays. And that's just inherently quite bad into Blackbeard, because you do not have on plays. In some of these other decks, though, I genuinely think RG Law could be quite good. And I think with the right pilot, this could easily be a tier 2 deck. I wouldn't be surprised to see this topping a regional. I just think, personally, it's a little bit weaker into Blackbeard, and a bit weaker into these black decks than Zoro. It's also quite a lot harder to play, so unless you're already very experienced with RG Law, I don't think it's one I would put a ton of time into, personally. RG Luffy, this is probably just stinking ass. Maybe you can put it in Dodgy. Aggro is inherently quite good this format, especially red aggro, because it helps you deal with Kid. But there's not really any reason to play this over RG Law. There wasn't since like the start of the game, and I don't think there really is now. Newgate as well. Maybe he has a chance with less removal. But honestly, I'm not seeing it. I don't think Newgate has much chance in this format. There's just so much aggro, and there's so much control. And Newgate is just kind of been power corrupt over the years. The same for Ace. Ace, I'll maybe put in Rogue. I think Flame Emperor just as a card is quite good. You remove a thing, and you have double attack. And double attack's actually not bad this format. Being just a big double attack hit is great into Purple Luffy. It's pretty good into Blackbeard. These green decks can be tough, but you are red, so you can deal with that potentially. I think Shanks is going to be a very tough matchup. They're so defensive, and they have kind of just better red cards than you. And then some of these aggro decks like Zoro and Dofi, if you don't see your answers early, are very, very bad. Dragon is just kind of like Bello Betty, but worse, but I think that gives him a slot in the Dodgy tier at least. Chopper is like Zoro, but worse. I think that gives him a slot in the Dodgy tier at least. Sanji is also a bit like Zoro, but worse. Whereas Zoro goes wide, Sanji goes tall, and I think generally that's worse. You have a worse matchup into Bonnie. You have, honestly, probably a better matchup into Blackbeard, because everything just has Rush, and Blackbeard really doesn't like that. You've got a worse matchup into Shanks for sure, and your Pluffy matchup is also probably a bit worse. You just have less volume of hits in exchange for bigger hits. I think more smaller hits are going to be better than Sanji's fewer large hits, in this format at least. Starlight 21 Luffy, I think is tier 2. Whereabouts in tier 2? I'm not sure. I think I'd put him about here. I do think it's considerably worse than Bello Betty and Zoro, but I think there's something to be said for this deck. This deck has a really good package. The 4-cost Zoro and the 5-cost Luffy are just really nice rush options, and of course having so much rush makes you inherently good into Blackbeard. You're also inherently decent into Shanks because you have so many extra dons. You actually get to swing quite large, which is really good. Bonnie and Smoker should also be fairly reasonable. You have the Mole Gun to deal with Kid. Where I think this deck falls a little short is into the blue decks in particular. Doflamingo and Boa are horrific. They bounce all your stuff, especially the Zoro. Having that Zoro bounced does not feel good. And into some of these black decks, especially Smoker because he can trash the Zoro, it also doesn't feel great. The deck is also inherently just not that powerful compared to Zoro. As much as you do have decent matchups across the big 5, and I think this could rise up to tier 1.5 with enough cooking. Currently, with the builds that I've been playing and that I've been seeing, I think tier 2 is a reasonable placement for this. RP Kid, I think has a chance in this meta, but until I see anything concrete from him, I'm going to leave him in the Dodgy tier. The deck's not bad, but it's also not great. In terms of finishing up the rogue decks, I think VV is going to go in stinking ass. You're inherently quite good into Blackbeard because you have Rush, but you're also inherently quite weak into Blackbeard because your leader can't attack. So it's kind of a trade-off. The deck's fine, it's just not super good, and I think I would rather play any of these other aggro red decks at the moment. RG Odin is one that I've been meaning to test out for a while, and I'm going to put him here with Red Yellow Sabo because I'm not confident in either of these. I think Red Green Odin has the potential to be a decent rogue or even tier 2 deck this format. However, until I test or see some results from him, I think I can't put him any higher than here. Just being red is inherently so strong this format, and with less removal, maybe you can stick as a 6k leader for a little bit more time than in previous formats. Finishing up the red decks, we've got Marco and RP Luffy. I think RP Luffy is going to be a very strong deck. I think I'm going to put him about here. You've got options for pretty much everything. Blackbeard, you've got big rush units like Dragon and Tenko Shanks. Can take a little while to get there, but once you do, you're dropping bomb after bomb after bomb, and they don't love dealing with that. They could 100% do it, but it's certainly not great, and being a 6k leader inherently just buys you a lot of cards into Blackbeard. Into Shanks, there's like a free matchup. You are Shanks, but a turn earlier because you're purple, and because you're 6, they don't have a leader effect, so it's pretty good. Into the green decks, you have red cards. You can run Mole Gun. You can run 10-cost Shanks to reduce the power of their stuff. You can run Pop Shanks to remove things like 9-cost Zoro that might be troublesome otherwise. Deck has a lot of options into green. And into purple Luffy, this is probably one of the tougher matchups. They are able to swing a lot of 6s very quickly. Aggro, you'd think would be bad because you're a 3-life leader, but you're also 6k. And you can play cards like 7-cost Kid and 10-cost Shanks, and we've seen in the past how that makes your Doflamingo matchup favoured. So I see no reason why that shouldn't do the same for things like Zoro. Bello Betty is awful though. Bello Betty, that's a terrible matchup. You can't beat that deck. I do think we could see RP Luffy rise potentially even above Doflamingo, but until we see some results, I'm going to leave him here in tier 1.5. Last red deck is Marco. I'm not confident in this placement. I've not tested Marco yet, but I've seen some chatter, so I'm going to put him with RG Odin and Red Yellow Sabo. All of these three I could see higher or lower. I've just not tested them yet, but I think on paper at least, and in theory, they should be reasonably strong. You've got blue cards, which are great into Shanks and Blackbeard. You've got red cards, which are great into Blackbeard and Ploofy, and dealing with 8-cost Kid. So inherently, I think this deck should be pretty good, but it's a 4-life leader, and it did struggle with aggro sometimes in the past. So we'll see. Definitely less confident in my opinion on this one. Now let's clean up these last decks. I think most of these are not the strongest. Lim, I'm going to put with Boa and Usopp. The strategy is great, but it's so inconsistent. If you get to have to go second, or you don't see like your 1-cost Lim on 1, or your 9-cost Zoro on 9, this deck feels really bad. I want to love Lim. I do love Lim. The deck's so fun. But it's just not consistent enough for me to put it any higher. Vegapunk, I'm going to put in Dodgy. I don't see much reason to play this. If you want to play aggro, you're better off playing Zoro or Betty. If you want to play control, which doesn't control anything anymore because you don't have access to Rego. That was one of the big selling points, was you can play Rego and you don't care because you just heal for 1 Don. But without that, I think you're really going to struggle into some of these big top-end decks. Odin, I'm going to put in Dodgy. I want to test out the Kinemonic Zodia build again. Now that the meta has changed, this could easily go down to stinking ass. But for now, I'm going to put it at the bottom of Dodgy. Arlong is also going in Dodgy. It's like a weird aggro deck. I think you're better off just playing like Dofi or Zoro if you want this playstyle. But if you really want to play Arlong, if you're an Arlong enthusiast, I don't think this meta is actually that bad for him. Nami, I know I said this wasn't ranked, but this is going to be right at the top of Dodgy, and this is in like the definition of Dodgy. This is matchup roulette. If you go into a regional and you see like Bonnie, Shanks, Bonnie, Smoker, Black, you can have a great time. But if you see Zoro, Dofi, Betty, Blackbeard, man, you're just going to lose every round. This is matchup roulette, like, on steroids. I wouldn't recommend playing this at the moment, but if we do see aggro fade out of the format, I do think Nami has a chance to rise up to tier 2 or even 1.5. This is just a meta call, and it always has been, and probably always will be. Buggy lost his best matchup in Doflamingo. Yes, Doflamingo still exists, but it's nowhere near as good as it used to be. And I think because of that, I can't put Buggy any higher than Dodgy. The deck's just not got the options to deal with some of these top answers. The Blackbeard matchup's weird because of the interaction with 10-cost Buggy, but your Shanks matchup is pretty bad. The aggro matchups are pretty bad, unless they're specifically playing 3 or 4 costs, which is great into something like a Zoro or a Doflamingo, but not great into something like a Purple Luffy, where a lot of their guys are 5s and 7s. You're also just not that great at dealing with 8-cost Kid. You don't have a good answer to Shiggy to remove the Kid, so you're sort of left swinging a bunch of times, and if they have the counter for 1 or 2 turns and start locking you with Dofi, it gets tough. Green Purple Luffy, I'm also going to put in Dodgy. He saw a little bit of success at Worlds, with mostly against BY and Dofi. Dofi's still here. BY I don't think is going to be here anymore, so I think there's less reason to play this than there was last format. But he did gain the new cards in the Resonante and Don Quixote Doflamingo, the Big Dofi, as well as the Sugar Searcher. So I think this could see a little bit of success. I wouldn't be surprised to see this get a top here or there, but I don't think I can put it any higher realistically until we see some results. Rebecca is like Usopp, but really hard and really cope. You're much slower than Usopp. You have a bit of a weaker time into the aggro matchups, I think. Of course, you have tons of cards, but you're also really reliant on seeing Corridor Coliseum, and you can't attack. You also have a worse time into the removal matchups for what that's worth. She's not bad, but I think inherently I'd just rather play Usopp than put the brain power into playing Rebecca and get probably slightly worse results overall. Foxy. I think Foxy's tier 2 now. He's weird. Like, you suck into removal, but there's less removal. You're pretty good into aggro, but not like hyper aggro. I don't know. I really don't know where to place this deck. This is not a deck I have the most experience with, so I'll put him here with these other 3 leaders that I want to test more. For now, I think tier 2 is fine. He's good into some decks and bad into others. And to finish up, we've got Reiju and Uso. Reiju, I'm going to put in tier 2, but right at the bottom, and this is below these decks that I'm not confident in. This is like an aggro deck that's not that great into Blackbeard, which isn't the best. Because you don't have your on plays, you can't draw cards with Reiju, you can't game rush with a Chiji, which is a little tough. And also into other aggro decks. Yes, you draw a lot of cards, but you're a full life leader, so it can be quite tough. I think having the Chiji to deal with Kid is strong, but you're just not as fast as some of these aggro decks, and you don't have as many resources as Purple Luffy. It's sort of this weird mid-ground, but it's definitely not bad. I think Reiju can compete, and the new Sanji Searcher is a nice consistency boost. Uta. This might be controversial, but I'm going to put Uta at the bottom of tier 1.5. Yeah, I'm going to put her here. You have a tough matchup into the green decks. Both Bonnie and Smoker are reasonably tough. You don't have great ways of dealing with 8-cost Kid other than just swinging into it a lot of times. I mean, that's not the worst plan, right? It's not the worst. We can play 8-cost Kid of our own as well and just initiate a war. Certainly into Bonnie, that war's going nowhere. Into Smoker, you're probably going to lose, so you've got to be a bit more aggressive. But we do have aggression with a lot of board span, and that's why I think you have a decent matchup into Blackbeard. Of course, they're going to turn off your on plays, but that's costing them cards, and you still have I'm Invincible to restand your leader and swing a bunch of times. Getting to draw a bunch of cards as well and play a bunch of bodies, swing back into things like Zoro and Dofi, and also establishing 8-cost Kid into things like Dofi is inherently just very strong. Of course, they can now red rock your Dofi, but you've got a lot of aggression. You're piling on a lot of pressure by spamming a big board with Luffy's and Brooks. So I think you have inherently good aggression into these other aggro decks, whilst also having great defense into them. The amount of cards you draw with this deck is just unreal. Your weakest matchups in the past were the removal decks, like Smoker and Lucci, but they're weaker now, so I do think Uta has the potential to be a decent contender this meta. So that's my tier list. Where do you disagree? Where am I wrong? Where are you right? Let me know everything and more in the comments below. This has been a very long video, so thank you if you sat through all the way to the end and listened to me yap. And a short disclaimer, there is no such thing as a correct tier list. Look at a game like Melee. Melee is a fixed game. They're not getting buffs, they're not getting nerfs. And that tier list changes every single year. It's kind of crazy. There's not going to be a solved format, certainly not within 3 months. And it can be hard to predict exactly where everything is going to fall, but this is just what I think. A lot of this is from my first couple of weeks of testing on the sim, as well as a bit of theory crafting as well. So let me know where your tier list differs from mine, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.